Hello, happy Friday, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. This is the third of the Sustainability Lecture and Dialogue series. It's really great to see everyone here. I'm very grateful for your presence. And today's theme is urban planning and social equity. And our two wonderful guest speakers today will share their respective research around this theme. Dr. John Stehlin is an assistant professor of geography, environment, and sustainability at UNCG. His research focuses on urban political economy, mobility and transportation infrastructure, and questions of spatial justice. He's the author of Cyclescapes of the Unequal City, Bicycle Infrastructure and Uneven Development. And this is from University of Minnesota Press, and it came out last year. So I encourage everyone to check it out. If you're a member of UNCG, it's available through the library too. Dr. Stehlin's talk today is entitled Highway Removal Projects, Urban Development Politics and Spatial Justice in the United States and Spain. Dr. Marcia Hale is an assistant professor of peace and conflict studies at UNCG. Her research sits at the nexus of global environmental change, environmental justice, migration, water, and agriculture. Through her research, she seeks to answer the question, how do we live together better? She's especially interested in how cities can serve as agents of global human security. And that is what she will speak about today. Dr. Hale's talk is entitled Cities as Instruments of Human Security, Water, Food, and Trauma Within Environmental and Climate Injustice. So let us welcome both speakers. We will first hear from Dr. Stehlin.
All right, can everyone hear me? Excellent. Thank you, Atsuko, for that very kind introduction. Thanks, Sean, for the invitation. Thanks, Marcia, for joining me today. I'm excited about this dialogue, and I'm going to start my watch now. And so my talk today, as Dr. Kinafuchi mentioned, is Highway Removal Projects, Urban Development Politics, and Spatial Justice in the United States and Spain. And this is really early new research, so I'm kind of trying some ideas out on you, so I'd be very eager for some feedback. So let's get started. So the US interstate highway system begun in 1956 cemented the primacy of the automobile and what scholars have referred to as fossil capitalism. And this has kept transportation emissions stubbornly at roughly 25% of all CO2 emissions. This was initially envisioned, as you can see on the left, as a way to connect cities, but it was also used to internally reorganize cities. So what you're seeing on the right is a plan for a group of highways in San Francisco that did not fully get built, in part because of revolts against this plan, although some of it was built. So in actual practice, these federal highway funds were used in many cases to expressly to demolish Black and working class neighborhoods that had been deemed, quote, slums, and or to separate them from more prosperous areas. So what you can see on the left is the demolition of highways in the demolition of a neighborhood in North Oakland to build highway. And then what you can see on the right is evidence of growing backlash against highway construction, especially in the 1960s. The tide began to turn with what were known as freeway revolts, the most successful of which, however, were by white neighborhoods like the West Village in New York, for example. Most damage had already been done by the 1960s. So this was the kind of the era of the freeway revolts. And then now we're talking about 50 years after this, a new wave of maybe freeway revolts or rethinking of freeways. So highways built at that time now face very steep repair bills. And also cities are now booming and starved for developable space. So organizations like the Congress for New Urbanism are taking aim at urban freeways and suggesting their removal, modeled off of early successes in Milwaukee, Portland, and San Francisco. So the Congress for the New Urbanism has an annual Freeway Without Futures report. It's increasingly been discussed in the media. And there is even kind of modest funding for these kinds of projects, although not nearly sufficient to do so at scale. The protagonists in the drama are not aggrieved neighborhoods primarily, but increasingly downtown interests seeing opportunities for reinvestment in underutilized land close to downtown. So this raises a number of different issues. The relationship between destruction and redevelopment, how infrastructure removal or repurposing has become a key mode of urban development, especially during periods of austerity. Secondly, at what scale is auto dependence reduced and traffic calmed? And what is to be done with the sprawl landscapes that the road network has created? So the suburbs are no longer principally wealthy white people as they were when the freeway system in the suburbs were being created, but increasingly Black and Latinx first-time homebuyers and new immigrants. And so what kinds of obligations has the road network created to people who are now dependent on that system? And then this kind of leads into the last kind of core issue. Do these projects begin to address historical injustices at the intersection of racism, environment, and mobility? For whom is the urban fabric being reconnected? What places are disconnected? And also long-term, what places should be disconnected if we're thinking in terms of long-term sustainability? The cases that I'm looking at are Rochester, Dallas, Madrid, and Spain. And I'll talk a little bit about why they actually kind of make sense all together. So I'll start with Rochester. Rochester is maybe a kind of paradigmatic example. You have a roadway here with excess capacity separating the most prosperous part of the downtown area, this area, sort of white middle-class neighborhood, from the downtown in the context of a broadly shrinking Rust Belt city and an only modestly growing region. And this project was envisioned by city planners as early as the 1990s. And what you can see is going from 1994 to 2018, this section of this urban loop was removed. It was a $22 million project funded by the Federal Transportation Investment Generating Economic Recovery Grant. It was completed in 2017, creating 6 new acres of land and generating roughly an estimated $200 million in investment, including beyond the original freeway footprint. Now, the next stage of this is the northern part, which passes through a much lower income Black and Latinx neighborhood. And now it's kind of at this stage of the project that the racial justice component and racial justice question is going to kind of come to the fore as a key issue. So this is maybe a kind of classic situation of Rust Belt city losing or slowly stabilizing population loss and just general overcapacity of the roadway, trying to use the removal of the roadway to jumpstart reinvestment. Now with Dallas, you see a significant contrast, right? Dallas is a booming Sunbelt region, the hub of a booming Sunbelt region, but nevertheless, the central city has lost population until recently because of rapid suburbanization. This is the section of roadway under debate, the I-345 separating downtown from the Deep Ellum area and the Baylor Medical Center area. And what you can see is over the past 20 or so years, there's been kind of development pressure pushing up against the edge of this area, sort of blocked by the freeway, some leaping over the freeway, but it's been a significant barrier to the expansion of downtown. Nevertheless, the state is continuing to invest in exurban highways. So it's not a case of general overcapacity. So I-345 is holding back downtown expansion into a prime kind of development or gentrifiable area. This is the highway on the left here, and the Deep Ellum neighborhood, which is a sort of hub of nightlife, historically a center for the blues, a working class Black district that is increasingly kind of gentrified. If you've been to East Austin, it's kind of similar in that regard. The proposal under consideration is coming primarily from downtown interests, real estate interests, and allies in the sort of architecture and design world. The proposed removal could create as much as $3.5 billion of investment. And crucially, the argument is that it can pay for itself. Now, the discussion about I-345 this summer coincided with the murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police and a broader conversation about racial justice. And so that could to a degree inflect the way the conversations are happening in this neighborhood. But there's a broader issue of the north-south divide in Dallas, where Black families are moving from the central city to the southern suburbs, while most jobs are being created in the north. And so I-345 is a crucial pass-through, again, raising this kind of broader scale question of justice, right? And really in neither Rochester nor Dallas, at least in my initial investigation, were environmental questions, either reducing carbon emissions or environmental justice, a major consideration. Okay, so Spain is a kind of interesting comparative case, and it might seem odd to put Spain and the US up against each other at the start, but Spain has the third largest freeway network in the world behind China and the US, and it's growing rapidly. So what you can see on the right is Spain rocketing past the rest of Europe in terms of lengths of motorways. It also had one of the largest and most devastating suburban housing bubbles in Europe in 2008, very much like the United States. What you can see on the left is the freeway network, which is very much organized around Madrid, the capital. And it might look like a lot of the freeway network is green in the sense of low emissions, but that's because it's this hypertrophy of freeways and broadly low utilization rates of freeways. So it's, again, it's this kind of solution in search of a problem type of thing. There's also this more recent history of massive investment in highways due to integration into the EU. So as a peripheral country with high unemployment, Spain had access to integration funds to promote equalization, sort of more like Greece, Italy, and Eastern Europe. There is also more pressure being placed on automobility in the cities of Spain. So on the left, you see a zero emissions area created by Madrid in 2018, which would ban internal combustion automobiles from this zone of the city center, but also a political backlash against those kinds of measures. So that was suspended with the new right-wing government taking power in 2019. So there's this kind of very complex brew at multiple scales of the sort of the politics of mobility here. The first case in Spain is Madrid, and it's this section of the A5 motorway running through the Latina district. Part of it was buried. You can see a sort of time lapse here. Part of it was buried as part of another project, which I'll talk about in just a second. But now this next stretch of the A5 is under consideration. This is a key corridor to the suburban, the suburbs that have been cropping up in the southwest of Madrid over the last 20 years as the central city becomes unaffordable for the middle classes. There are these sort of suburban working class cities that are connected by this highway, as well as rail, but especially by the highway. So this was the earlier project I was mentioning, the M30, which was a $6 billion project completed in 2007. And at that point, it was the largest public-private partnership in Europe. This was widely considered to be a success, but it also stoked gentrification in this area as it extended the city center beyond its previous boundary, which had been the highway and the river, into the kind of southwestern portion of the city. And it actually added roadway capacity. So I think this is really important. It maybe reduced the kind of surface disfiguring elements of highways, but it actually expanded the highway and its capacity to move automobiles through the city. So the A5 is a feeder to the M30, and that section that was already buried is now kind of parkland and low-speed boulevards. But the section that was not buried looks like this, with high-speed roads passing within feet of the doors of people's apartment buildings and their balconies. The previous socialist government proposed converting the A5 into a boulevard with traffic signals, a bus priority lane, and bike lanes. So actually reducing throughput, reducing traffic flow. But there was a popular revolt by the southwestern suburbs, and there was also a kind of ideological backlash by the incoming conservative government. So they removed the traffic signals. This basically says the polemics over the traffic signals have ended. And their newest proposal is to bury this section of the freeway as well. A thing to point out is that Spain's economy is really dominated by large infrastructure firms. So this is a very common kind of common feature of the political economy of this particular context. Now, Bilbao has the appearance of a more kind of traditional highway removal project. This is the area that is in question here. This is a widely hated viaduct passing through this neighborhood, again, right by like 3 feet away from people's windows. And this was the access point for this larger highway here. It was removed in 2013. And so you can see in 2013, you have this boulevard conversion, parkland, some of the similar things that you're seeing in other places, but also the expansion of highway access, if you can see my mouse cursor here, and a stadium redevelopment. So it actually reconfigured rather than just removed roadway access. So this is what it looked like when it was redeveloped. Again, the sort of removal of this widely hated structure known as the Scyllatric, which is the kind of Spanish version of an erector set, and replacement with a bike path and parkland and a sort of low speed boulevard. Lots of kind of urban beautification, new construction, new housing sales, that kind of stuff. But it actually led to a conflict between this neighborhood and the neighborhood that then got the actual kind of expansion of freeway access really kind of nearby. And these are both kind of lower middle class, working class kind of neighborhoods at the sort of periphery, the southern periphery of the kind of center of Bilbao. So it's a kind of a similar situation. So as I said, I'm really early days here right now, but some kind of themes that have emerged for me. Number one is that there is a lot of low-hanging fruit, especially in the United States, of underutilized highways that are facing steep repair costs, right? There are dozens of them across the country. Paradoxically, I think the lack of funding for huge tunneling projects in the US, although of course the example of Boston's Big Dig, and now there's projects in Seattle that's doing something similar, but the relative lack of funding for such kind of huge projects because of austerity and the preference for new highways rather than retrofits has made it also kind of less likely that they may fund affordable housing or other kind of social investments, because it's really about priming the pump for development, right? That's kind of the logic behind the federal grants like Tiger, or that this will pay for itself, like in the Dallas case. And what seems to matter most, at least in the US context, is freeing land up for redevelopment. So people I spoke to in Dallas talked about, free land. People I spoke to in Rochester said, clean land in a city that doesn't have it, right? So this, in my mind, tends to kind of supersede some environmental and social questions, although the racial justice, the issues of racial justice that are being raised right now are likely to put pressure on this because of the history of demolition of Black neighborhoods by highways. But there's also kind of coordination across scales does not seem to be especially common. There's not a corresponding effort to more evenly distribute jobs, housing, services at a regional scale for the most part. So what does this mean for us locally? Greensboro is modestly investing in more concentrated mobility, better transit, while also the state is expanding the urban loop highway system. And again, this looks like, a situation in search of a problem from a certain way of looking at things, or invention being the mother of necessity. And that's how it works. When you add highway capacity, it creates more travel. In terms of my action suggestion that was requested, I don't think that we'll be stopping this highway. It's halfway done, although some funding source could collapse and theoretically construction could grind to a halt. But I think there's also a reason for us to organize around systematically reducing roadway capacity, particularly the form of roadways. If you think about even sort of quasi highways like Josephine Boyd on the edge of campus, right? These are part of that mid-century hypertrophy of everything looks like a freeway essentially. In cities like Greensboro, especially, that don't have interstate highways passing directly through them, right? We sort of made our own highways. This, of course, needs to be paired with greater investment in public transit. And in general, I think we need to kind of, from an ethical perspective, speed up the process by which highways become considered irrelevant and obsolete, right? But this also has to be paired with an actual kind of material transformation in how people are able to get around. So I think what is needed is more organizing around the question of mobility justice, rather than as cyclists or as pedestrians or as transit drivers or transit users, but mobility justice, and also the need to be somewhat forthright about mobility constraint as a key part of justice. So I'll leave it there. Thank you, everyone. And I would like to acknowledge support from the department, the Office of Research Engagement, master's student in GES, Nathan McMenamin, and some colleagues, Nate Millington and Sarah Knuth, who I've been bouncing these ideas off of for a long time. So thank you, everyone.
Marcia, make sure you unmute yourself.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Sean. Saying hi, everyone. It's an honor to follow Dr. Stehlin's talk. And I'd just like to begin by, thanking Dr. Kenefuchi and Sean for inviting me, and to the UNCG Sustainability Council and Office of Sustainability for keeping this very important series going during the midst of pandemic. So today I'm going to be presenting on this topic of cities as instruments of human security. And to kind of frame this, I just want to introduce this topic as one that I'm approaching from a very transdisciplinary lens. So my background is in development and urban planning. And of course, I'm teaching and researching now through a lot of lenses from the field of peace and conflict studies. And then realizing that this series is for, of course, scholars and students here at UNCG and other academic institutions, but also for, community members that are interested in these topics. I've kind of designed this, this presentation and this slideshow to kind of steer away from a more traditional research talk. So I won't present really any methods, but I will have little outtakes on each slide, or each slide that has relevant publications attached to the content. So if folks are interested in learning more about the research itself, you're more than welcome, of course, to go to those publications. And I believe Sean's going to send a follow-up email with some links. So I'll point to those as we go forward. I don't know why. Sorry, y'all. I don't know why my slides are not progressing here.
Marcia, I was having to just click the arrow because it thinks you're in Zoom rather than in your presentation.
Okay, thanks, John. Yeah, I was oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, it looks like it was frozen for a moment, but now it seems to be going. So hopefully it'll be smooth from here on out. So as we dive in, I just want to frame, this sustainability challenge really of social injustice in urban spaces, which is also through the lens of peace and conflict studies. We can think of it as, the conflict of injustice in urban spaces that then is available for interventions. So we can bring, interventions aimed at prevention, resolution, and transformation, which we'll talk about more in a moment. But first, I just wanted to explore the concept of human security a bit. So while national security, of course, places the focus of efforts at the level of the nation state or the state apparatus, human security is interested in the well-being, really, of individual humans. And it's looking at basic human needs. So it's saying that in order for any nation to truly be secure, the individual human beings within that nation state need to have their basic human needs met, including access to food, water, shelter, as well as legal processes and justice. And so this concept was codified at the level of the UN all the way back in 1994. And throughout this presentation, I'll continue to kind of point back to global frameworks, and particularly the UN, because that will be part of my kind of call to action at the end of the presentation. So for those who aren't really nested in thinking about cities or urban spaces, I just wanted to kind of contextualize us in the importance of cities by pointing to a couple of different factors, including the fact that more than half of the world's population is urban or lives in cities. You can imagine the upstream and downstream impacts created by all of those humans functioning basically in an urban space. So the upstream and downstream impacts of water use, I think, is one visual that's really tangible. Shifting geopolitics. So as political alliances shift, and especially in the last 4 years, we've seen a lot of that. It opens up spaces for more local actors to fill in the gaps, especially around human and environmental protections. And as we think of levers of change, of course, localized governance happens within a city framework and often through practices and processes of urban planning. So odd. So the field of urban planning, though, before we move on, I wanted to situate us within this legacy of, social brutalities really that have been enacted by the field. So urban planning carried out the mandates of colonialism, which was definitionally, extractive and operating through a racist logic. And then, of course, within the US, our racist logic was enacted through planning practices such as zoning, redlining, and racial covenants, among many others. However, cities do have this potential to, be forces both regionally and globally. And again, just to point to those upstream and downstream impacts and thinking specifically about greenhouse gas emissions and the percentage of greenhouse gas emissions that are connected to cities. So they produce about 70% of CO2. And CO2 constitutes about 76% of the greenhouse gases that are implicated in climate change. So we see councils of mayors, of course, that are really active in fighting climate change at local levels. And then also sanctuary cities are becoming more and more important as global environmental change is driving migration, and national governments especially are enacting brutal practices. So cities can be spaces of sanctuary for people who are migrating through. And again, to point back to the United Nations, the UNEP, or the United Nations Environment Program, has been really instrumental in trying to think about cities as these very powerful actors. And GeoCities is a report that comes out every several years that kind of scopes both problems and best practices. So especially for those students of peace and conflict studies that might be here today, we're about to go into 4 case studies, and I just wanted to frame those case studies as, looking toward justice and sustainability, but really thinking about conflicts around justice and sustainability as wicked problems, which are intractable conflicts. But of course, seeing these problems as conflicts allows us to think about interventions towards resolution. So conflict resolution looks to resolve an issue. Conflict prevention looks to prevent future issues. And then conflict transformation understands that within these wicked problems or intractable conflicts, there often isn't easy or even, feasible conflict resolution. And so how do we transform, our individual consciousness and our relationships so that we can stay engaged with the issues? And so here's an example of one of those little boxes in which, if you're interested in concepts, especially of justice and sustainability, here's a publication that you could go to. And again, Sean, I think we'll be sending those out after the presentation. So I invite us, as we go into these case studies, to think of conflict transformation really through this question of how do we stay in relationship with each other? And so these 4 case studies are going to be located within interrelated dynamics or wicked problems related to global environmental change, which is essentially changes in Earth systems. So that's climate change, but it's also changes in ocean and forest systems, the hydrologic cycle, and urbanization. And of course, migration is really being driven by global environmental change. We're going to be seeing more of it in the future. And infrastructure transitions, which John, started to unpack for us a little bit in the previous presentation. So there are all these infrastructures around the world, such as, roadways, water systems, energy systems that are aging out or just irrelevant to the current context. And so they're transitioning, or there are these gaps in service that are created. And especially as, more of the global population urbanizes, this becomes an issue. And then of course, we're going to be hitting on environmental and climate injustice and water and food insecurity. So the first wicked problem that I'd like to talk about is trauma. And this is a publication that hopefully will be out soon. And this is a little outtake that I just wanted to highlight a couple of key points, basically in saying that trauma is really a shattering of one's worldview or of one's internal world. And it can have lifelong consequences, which is a big issue because cities are both receiving and creating trauma. So they're receiving trauma, of course, through migration, both domestically and internationally or globally. But they're also creating trauma. And again, we can think back to those, kind of colonial and racist logics driving urban governance and planning, but also ongoing poverty, segregation, and inequality. So one intervention here would be trauma-informed planning. So trauma-informed practice basically is infusing itself into multiple disciplines, including education, various, kind of arenas within the medical field. And so there's a call here to bring trauma-informed lenses to urban planners so that planners can be conscious of both the trauma that people are bringing to community engagement, but also how processes and practices can re-traumatize folks. And as an example of what transformation could look like here, there's great power in narrative. And one of the ways that we get re-traumatized is when our narratives or our experience isn't received and isn't reflected. And so we can think about cultural or intergenerational trauma. And here in the United States, of course, we have both cultural and intergenerational trauma connected to systems of slavery and ongoing racism. And we saw in downtown Greensboro, where these photos kind of situate you, this past summer, the Black Lives Matter movement, really projecting truth. So in our field of peace and conflict studies, we talk about truth and reconciliation. There can be no reconciliation without truth. And so these practices of public art are a way of truth telling. And here, you can see the names, truth telling the names of people who were killed by police, and especially Black men and women who were killed by police. Here's a public art piece kind of expressing unity within that injustice. S is this one, and S are these three. Now for the second case study that kind of locates us in environmental and climate injustice, we'll also be looking at conflict transformation here. And I take you to Princeville. So here we are in Greensboro. Princeville's about 2.5 hours from here. And Princeville was the first town established by people who had been enslaved in the United States. So in the last 20 years, the town and that proud history has sort of been buried underneath floodwaters related to 2 hurricanes. But the residents of Princeville are determined to rebuild and to rebuild around this narrative or this identity of being the first town to have been formally established by people who'd been enslaved. And they're also engaged in public art projects. And this is the Humanities Action Lab project, which again will be in the links. And several of us researchers here at UNCG partnered with the town to create this exhibit. And it's currently traveling along with other installations for about 3 years, and it will return to Greensboro in 2023. So hopefully you'll all be able to come out and see it then. So water insecurity, of course, is a phenomenon that is happening in all corners of the globe, but is especially, or it's distinct, maybe is a better way to phrase that, in cities. So within our cities, we see this dynamic of privatized water. And you might see reports or statistics of, water being, available, 100% water availability in cities, especially in the global north and the global west. However, that's really a statistic that's capturing water being supplied to buildings rather than to people. So throughout history, if you move through city space, you would often find fountains. And you can see this is, kind of a standpipe in Greece. This is a bubbler system in Maine. This is, an urban fountain in Turkey. And this is also, I believe, outside of Athens. But today, of course, water is increasingly privatized. So a lack of fountains in urban spaces, period. Also water, being available strictly by, bottled water, or being privatized through restrooms for customers only. And so the call here really is to expand drinking fountains back into the urban fabric. And specifically though, to cite those fountains in places in which people moving through the city that are not connected to permanent buildings. And especially, again, we can think about people going through processes of migration or homelessness. So there's a famous case of Paris introducing fountains back into the urban fabric, but they are sparkling water fountains in high tourist areas. So the call here is to site those fountains in areas where people are moving through that, again, are not connected to homes or permanent buildings. And then finally, food insecurity is our last conflict. And here I'll take you for a moment to Cape Town, South Africa. So the city is located at the tip of South Africa. And you can see here, this area right in the middle of the city is a huge horticultural area that's been zoned since the 1800s horticultural. However, developers have been pushing to have that land rezoned and have been, creating plans for prisons and hotels. So farmers within the area are organizing underneath this banner of the Philippi Horticultural Area Campaign to not only keep the land zoned horticultural, but to put it back in the pot of land that is available for post-apartheid transformation. So during the apartheid era, of course, so we know, first of all, that race is a social and political construct. In South Africa, that construct was labeled as white South Africans, Black South Africans, and then colored South Africans. That color designation sort of capturing everyone who was not European or Indigenous African. And so during apartheid, colored South Africans and Black South Africans were forcibly removed from their land. And when that system ended, transformation was supposed to take place in which people would be given land back. However, land is usually given back, so to speak, far outside of the city in the townships or the slums. And so the Philippi Horticultural Campaign, really led by this farmer here, Nazir Sunday, is fighting to have the land kept horticultural, shift into organic farming, and then also be put in that post-apartheid transformation pot so that it can be given back to people who were kicked off their land. Therefore, providing people with, workable land that is closer into the city and also connected to food. And so up here, you can see, and again, this will go out in the email, these links. If you're interested in this kind of work, it's happening here locally in several different forms. This link will take you to a talk given by folks who are involved in agricultural justice within the US legal system. I also just want to flag that our local EJ network, or our North Carolina EJ network, is very much involved in agricultural justice. And the annual summit has moved online, so that's happening basically tonight and tomorrow morning. So anyone who's interested can sign up and join that. And then of course, there's going to be a talk within this series next Friday with some other UNCG professors on urban agriculture and sustainability. So finally, I'll end here just by, kind of responding to that request for a call to action. Yeah, just to state one more time that, we're better together. So conflict transformation is about staying in relationship with each other and focusing on how we are related to one another, especially in today's world, thinking about the regional and the international networks that connect us and how threatened they are. I think is one of the most important calls to action in this regard. So especially thinking about the UN. We talked a little bit about GeoCities, but also, of course, there's the Paris Climate Agreement and the World Health Organization that, the United States has pulled out of. So to keep these things in mind, of course, as we vote before November 3rd, so the call to action here also is to vote before November 3rd, but then also moving forward, and the encouragement to use lenses such as just sustainabilities, which connects human and environmental health and trauma to understand really the impact of the policies and the politicians that we're voting on. So with that, I think I'll close and hand it back over to Dr. Kinafuchi. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Stehlin and Dr. Hale. That was really wonderful, and I learned so much just by, it's a short presentation from each, but I learned so much from both of you. Really make me think about the importance of, our relationship to the place we live and how that's connected to human relationships too. So at this point, I would like to see if anyone has questions for either one of them or both of them.
Shannon, you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, I have a quick question. First, thank you both the panelists for your time and for both these presentations. I really enjoyed both of them. My question is specifically for John. I thought about in the last example that you brought up, if there's any negative externalities that y'all have seen associated with the relocation of freeways. I was thinking about, you had mentioned, you'd showed the pictures of, what it had looked like before and then without the freeway system in Spain, and how some of the things that have happened after that are like housing prices have gone up because then people want to live somewhere where there's not a freeway and they've relocated it. Does that not just lead to just eventual gentrification, right? Like, you're not just relocating those problems to somewhere else.
Yeah, thank you for that, Shannon. I think a first stab of that is like, yes, that's exactly right. And that's kind of like part of the model, right? Like the big success stories, especially like Portland and San Francisco, it was kind of forced by an earthquake, but when this widely hated freeway that was basically separating downtown from this slowly gentrifying neighborhood, when that was removed, it was like a gentrification bomb went off, basically. San Francisco is a sort of a special case because it's just itself a gentrification bomb. So like we can't totally just extrapolate from that, but like, Seoul, South Korea did something similar and it was a kind of a similar effect. So I think that's where I kind of put my scale hat on. And I'm like, I think where the problem is a sort of like that it's a very kind of localized set of effects and a localized kind of promise of a certain kind of desirable effect, rather than a kind of broader kind of commitment to reducing not just roadway capacity, but like the demand, the unwanted but necessary demand for mobility. Like you have to drive a certain degree, whether you like it or not. And I think that's very different from kind of enhancing people's capacity for mobility. Some people have very limited capacity for mobility within the current system, and some people have just like so much that they don't know what to do with it, right? But everything that limits it feels like some sort of violation of their freedom.
Thank you, John. Sarah?
Thanks, John and Marcia. Those were both great talks, and I think they complemented each other really well. So kudos to the organizers as well for putting those two talks together. Question for Marcia. Marcia, it's good to see you. It's been a while. I really am intrigued by this idea of trauma-informed urban planning. I think that is a framework that would be applicable to many types of decision-making frameworks as a society. So I'd just be interested in hearing a little more about like what the principles behind that type of planning would look like how that's different from the traditional urban planning approach. So how it would work operationally, and also how that overlaps with other sort of justice frameworks like truth and reconciliation or reparations.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Really good to see you. So Sarah and I used to be neighbors. I slid out, I moved to take a faculty and residence position. So I'm living around the corner now from your office in Spartan Village. So I think the trauma-informed lens specifically brought to the field of urban planning would look like a lot of, the mandates around community engagement, participatory planning, other justice lenses. However, the big distinction would be training in what trauma looks like and its effects, again, that are not only, you know, kind of around the experience itself of trauma, but can be lifelong. So especially since planners engage community in such meaningful ways, hopefully in most places, to be trained in a trauma-informed lens would help planners that are engaging with community to understand the trauma that folks are bringing into the room. But also, so it would be looking at things such as, you know, racial injustice, not just as an injustice that hopefully the field of planning can help to transform, but also really understanding the health impacts of that injustice. So I think that might be the big distinction for planners who are already kind of working through a justice lens, is becoming more aware of the long-term mental, emotional, and physical impacts of trauma. And how it would interface with other processes around, you know, truth and reconciliation and reparations. I'm not sure. That's actually, you know, a conversation that's, I know is happening in a couple of different ways in Canada, especially around some of the schools that Indigenous Canadians were sent to or First Nations were sent to. And it's an interesting area for me of research, but I don't have any answers there yet.
Thank you. Alex, I don't know if you want to unmute, but John, we have a question from Alex in the chat. What do you find is the split between maintaining previous freeway land as public and repurposing for parks or other multimodal transit versus selling the land to the private sector for development?
In terms of, I'll say like in terms of my empirical research, I haven't gotten quite that deep, although you're seeing like in Spain, obviously you see it's mostly park, kind of park reclamation. And in the US, it seems to be at least part of the promise is, you know, increasing the tax base, promoting development. I think that the like a sort of a provisional answer would be, you know, thinking about the leverage, and, you know, people I've talked to in Dallas have talked about this, right? There is leverage in like the land gets transferred to the city, right? And if you can create leverage for things like racial justice, in the case of Rochester, there was a significant amount of housing, not a ton, but a significant amount for people who had additional mobility needs. There was housing for, I think, the formerly incarcerated. So those are kind of levers because the city actually owns the land for a period of time before dispensing it for some sort of private development. But I mean, I think it's interesting because it opens up a question of like having a maybe more muscular role for the public sector in deciding what we actually want, rather than just sort of creating areas within which the private sector can decide to meet that zoning requirement or whatever, that kind of thing.
Great, thank you. Any more questions? John, you want to say something extra?
I was interested in the kind of trauma-informed lens that Marcia brought up, because one of the things that I'm just starting to get into that I didn't really expect from the Spain stuff is the politicization of sound, and like sound as trauma, like just like the constant cars going by at all hours. In the US, I think we're like used to things like asthma rates and stuff like that, but I was interested in sort of these other kinds of trauma from like that aren't kind of familiar to our American lenses that are being kind of politicized in other places.
That's really fascinating, John. I'd love to talk more about it. I haven't encountered that situation in Spain before. It's really interesting that Spaniards are talking about that as traumatic, sound as traumatic. It would be interesting to explore it more. It just makes me think too, maybe as a closing piece for myself, you know, of course, the slippery slope that we're constantly on in regard to justice and human rights. So, thinking about, frameworks and understanding of justice and human rights that are, still being contested. I think trauma, as we were talking about earlier, really is the next layer. So to think about justice as a universal value that we should all be, giving space to is step one. And then I think another step in is really thinking about the lifelong impacts of what injustice looks like. And that could be everything, I guess, including exposure to sound trauma.
I just want to add what Joan and Marcia just said about sound pollution and trauma. And I was just thinking that it's a really wonderful lens to look at how the urbanization does to birds and their ability to use their songs, and that the same thing is affecting humans' ability to be healthy. And so I think that's really an interesting and fascinating approach.
All right, well, we're a few minutes over, but we don't mind sticking around if anybody's got some additional questions or comments or news to share. Okay, well, we really appreciate it. We are going to continue to have more talks. I'm just going to put the next one in the link. It's with Dr. LaGreco and Dr. Chiotto. I haven't met Plexitas yet, so I'm not sure if I pronounced your last name right. And they're going to be speaking about urban agriculture and food systems, and that's next Friday at noon. Make sure you register for that, because we like to keep the Zoom invites private so that we don't get bombed. But yeah, thank you again to Dr. Kinafuchi for being such a great partner with me on this event, and to Dr. Hale and Dr. Stehlin for your lectures. I will be sending out links to everybody. Dr. Praskovitz, who had some comments today too, gave us a talk a couple weeks ago, and I will also send a link to her talk when I email everybody. Have a great weekend. Thank you again so much for coming out, and take care of yourselves and your families. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.